Chapter 19, Section 3 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 2. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 2, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 19, The Principate of Galba and the Year of the Four Emperors, Section 3. Vitellius and Vespasian. Vitellius himself, meanwhile, had been moving, with characteristic torpor, through Gaul. He had with him about 60,000 men, including the strength of the Germanic armies and some divisions which had been sent from Britain. The tidings of victory reached him at the same time as the announcement that the Mauritanian provinces had declared for him. Lysias Albinus had been appointed procurator of Caesariensis by Nero, and the Tingitane province had been added to his sway by Galba. On Galba's death he embraced the cause of Otho and threatened Spain. But Clavius Rufus, the legatus of Tarraconensis, on whom it devolved to provide for the military protection of Baetica, succeeded in slaying Albinus and his chief supporters. It was said that Albinus had some thought of reviving for himself the royal title which had expired with King Juba. The imperator descended the river Arar in a barge, and at Lugdunum was met by his victorious generals Valens and Caecina. Here he conferred his own title of Germanicus upon his infant son. The vengeance of Vitellius chiefly fell upon subordinate officers, especially those of the Illyrian legions, which were sent back to their stations. His rival's brother Titianus, Suetonius, Proculus, and Marius Celsus were all spared. Vitellius, perhaps, did not forget that his own wife and children had been spared by Otho. The 14th Legion, which had been removed from Britain by Nero, was now sent back there. The Legio Classica was dispatched to Spain. The Praetorian Guard was disbanded, and a new guard formed from the Germanic soldiers, who demanded this promotion in return for their services. Thus the principle that the Praetorians should consist only of Italian levies was transgressed. The new guard consisted of 16 corps of 1,000 men each, instead of 9 as before. The 4 urban corps were also organized anew. Rome was overrun by soldiers. Besides the new guards, there were 4 legions, 4 divisions of other legions, 34 corps of auxilia, and 12 squadrons of cavalry, all of which had entered Rome with the victor and treated it as a captured city. The administration of Vitellius was better than might have been expected from the license of his subordinates. He filled the offices of his household with knights, not with freedmen. He respected the independence of the Senate and attended its meetings. When he was opposed in the Curia, he observed that it was not strange that 2 senators should differ, that he himself had sometimes dissented from Thrasea. He forbade processes for maiestas, and confirmed the privileges which had been granted by his predecessors. He also made laws against the practice of Roman knights degrading themselves by fighting in the arena, and banished astrologers from Italy. Whereas Galba and Otho had adopted the cognomen Caesar as part of their imperial style, Vitellius refused to affiliate himself thus to the Julian dynasty. He had postponed the assumption of the title Augustus, but it was pressed on him when he arrived in Rome. On the other hand, he permitted a perpetual consulship to be decreed to him. In regard to his attitude to the Senate, it is important to remark that he dated his accession, dies imperii, not from the day on which the army had saluted him imperator, but from the decree of the Senate after Otho's death. But the real power lay with Valens and Caecina. They encouraged the emperor in the coarse sensuality to which he was naturally addicted, while they enriched themselves and made all the state appointments. The cost of increasing the number of praetorians, and the extravagant expenditure of the gluttonous princeps on the pleasures of the table, led soon to a deficit, to meet which the coinage was depreciated. While Western Europe was rent with civil wars and emperors rose and fell in rapid succession, the legions of the East looked on with surprise and indifference. Galba and Otho were acknowledged in Syria and Judea; even Vitellius was accepted for a moment. But when it was fully grasped that Vitellius had been elevated by the Germanic army, a dormant spirit of jealousy began to awake in the legions of the East, just as the Germanic legions themselves had been excited at the elevation of Galba in Spain. If a princeps could be made out of Italy, why should he not be made in the East as well as in the North? If the army of the Rhine created an emperor, if the army of the Danube supported another, why should not the army of the Euphrates have their candidate too? This feeling spread among both officers and men, and the East determined to assert itself in the comitia of the empire. The only question was, who should be the candidate? The most natural person to select was Gaius Licinius Mucianus, the legatus of Syria, a man of noble birth, an experienced and able diplomatist, popular with the soldiers. But he refused, perhaps because he had no children, and thought it vain to attempt to found a permanent monarchy, except as a dynasty. Then all eyes turned to Titus Flavius Vespasianus, the legatus of Judea. He was not a man of high descent like Mucianus. He was born of obscure family at Phalocrine, near Riati, the town of Aro. We have already met him doing good service in the conquest of Britain as the commander of a legion. He had afterwards held the consulship, on 51 A.D., but the fall of Narcissus, his patron, interrupted his career, and it was not till after the death of Agrippina that he again took part in public life as the proconsul of Africa, in 63 A.D., which he administered with integrity. He followed in Nero's train to Greece, and was appointed by that monarch governor of Judea in 66 A.D., to suppress a formidable rebellion which had broken out there. He was slowly and surely carrying this task to a successful issue when the news of Nero's death came, upon which he withdrew his troops from the field of action and ceased hostilities. This act does not imply any ulterior motives on the part of Vespasian. His office was delegated to him by Nero, and his authority expired with the death of the imperator who delegated it, so that he had no legal position to act until his powers were delegated to him anew by another imperator. On July 1st, Vespasian was proclaimed imperator at Alexandria by Titus Julius Alexander, the augustal prefect of Egypt, and from this day Vespasian dated the beginning of his reign. A few days later the Judean legions followed with enthusiasm at Caesarea, and Mucianus, who zealously assumed the role of a kingmaker, secured the adhesion of both soldiers and citizens at Antioch. A probably forged letter of Otho was produced, calling upon the East to avenge his death, and Mucianus inflamed the soldiers by stating that Vitellius intended to recall them from their luxurious quarters in Syria and replace them by the legions of Gaul and Germany. The choice of the armies was supported by the vassal kings, Sohemus of Sophene, Antiochus of Commagena, and Agrippa II, lord of Batanea, Trachonitis, and other districts. Negotiations were made with the king of Parthia to ensure the safety of the eastern provinces during the absence of the legions in the west, and he even offered to place at Vespasian's disposal a force of mounted cavalry, but this offer was refused. A council of war was held at the colony of Berytus, where Mucianus and Vespasian concerted measures for the campaign against Vitellius. It was decided that Mucianus should lead the expedition to the west, and that Vespasian himself should occupy Egypt, whose possession was very important in a war against Italy, as Rome depended for her corn supply chiefly on Egypt. Titus, the son of Vespasian, took his father's place in Judea. Mucianus marched westward through Cappadocia and Phrygia. The number of his troops was not large, only about 20,000 or 25,000 men, but he relied upon the accession of the armies of the Illyric provinces, which burned to avenge the death of Otho. The unanimity of the Eastern and Illyric armies was expressed on coins issued at this period with the word consensus exercitum. In Mysia 3 legions were stationed, the 3rd Gallica, the 8th Augusta, and the 7th Claudiana. Of these the 3rd had been originally in Syria and was transferred to Mysia by Nero. Mucianus relied on its adhesion, and it did not fail him. The other 2 followed its example. The 2 legions in Pannonia, the 13th Gemina and the 7th Galbiana, eagerly embraced the cause of Vespasian. They were smarting under the defeat which their contingents had experienced at Betriacum and the treatment which they received from Vitellius. The 13th had been employed by Caecina and Valens in the construction of amphitheatres at Bononia and Cremona, and had then been sent back to their winter station at Petovio. Antonius Primus, a native of Tolosa and legatus of the Spanish legion of Galba, threw himself ardently into the cause. The legion in Dalmatia, the 11th Claudiana, followed the example of the others, but with less zeal. Emissaries of Vespasian won the adhesion of the 14th legion, which was returning to Britain. The march of Mucianus was slow, like that of Valens through Gaul. He collected money as he went, on the principle that money is the sinews of civil war. He was fully aware of the difficulty of the enterprise. He had a high idea of the valor of the Germanic legions, and his wish was, if possible, to avoid bloodshed and reduce Italy by a blockade. The stoppage of corn supplies from Egypt might, it was expected, produce a revolution in Rome. But the Illyric legions, under the influence of Antonius Primus, took matters into their own hands, and did not wait for the arrival of the eastern forces. At a council of war held at Petovio, Primus urged the expediency of surprising Italy while it was still unprepared, and his counsels were adopted, in spite of the letters from Mucianus and the opposition of the governor of Pannonia, Tempius Flavianus. The latter was suspected by the soldiers of sympathy with Vitellius, and had little influence. A message was sent to Aponius Saturninus, governor of Mysia, to hurry on with his army. The Jazyges, who dwelled between the Danube and the Theiss, were engaged to undertake the defence of the Danube during the absence of the legions, and 2 Suevian kings, Sido and Italicus, joined the expedition against Italy. The procurator of Rhaetia was faithful to Vitellius, and in order to prevent him from intervening, troops were sent to the river Inn, which divided Rhaetia from Noricum. Primus advanced in front of the main body, with some detachments of horse and foot. He occupied Aquileia and the passes of the Julian Alps, but instead of waiting on the confines of Italy, as Mucianus desired, he proceeded to Operturgium, Oderzo, and Altinum, in which places he was gladly welcomed. Patavium declared for his cause, and likewise Atesti, east, where he heard that some Vitellian troops were stationed at Forum Elianae, which is perhaps the modern Lenhago on the Adige. He surprised them, and thus the beginning of the war declared in favor of the Flavians, as the party of Flavius Vespasianus was called. On the news of this small success, the 2 Pannonic legions marched rapidly to Patavium, and it was decided to make Verona the basis of further operations. Vicenza, was taken on the march to Verona, which city they prepared to besiege. The 3rd and the 8th legions soon arrived from Mysia. Outside Verona, the governor of Pannonia, Flavianus, and the governor of Mysia, Aponius, were set upon by the soldiers, who suspected them of treachery to the cause, and escaped with difficulty. Their flight left the conduct of the campaign entirely in the hands of Primus. Meanwhile, Vitellius was ill prepared to oppose the forces which had approached to wrest the empire from his hands. The breaking up of the old legions for the sake of the reorganization of the praetorians had been, under the circumstances, a fatal mistake. They were weakened, not only by the decrease of numbers, but by the relaxation of discipline in their Italian quarters, and there was no bond between the veterans and the new recruits, who were raised to fill up the maniples. Vitellius formed a new legion from the marines of the fleet of Misenum. He expected reinforcements from the provinces, but the governors of Germany, Britain, and Spain made excuses for delay. Africa alone, where Vitellius had formerly won popularity as proconsul, showed some alacrity. When the news of the approach of the enemy came, Caecina was sent on to defend the north of Italy. Valens was detained at Rome by illness. The army which Caecina led against the Illyric legions wore a very different appearance from that which it presented when it descended from the Alps to play the part which the Illyric legions were now about to play against it. The Germanic troops had lost their vigor and their enthusiasm. They were enervated by the climate, their arms were in bad order, their horses lazy. The vigor of Caecina himself had suffered from the pleasures of success, and perhaps he meditated treachery before he left the city, under the influence of Flavius Sabinus, the prefect of the city, Vespasian's elder brother. The plan of Caecina was to make the river Ephesus the line of defence. Cavalry were sent in advance to occupy Cremona, which played an important part in this as in the former war. The 5th Elauda and the 22nd Primigenia, with the divisions of 4 other legions, followed. Last of all, the 21st Rapex and the 1st Italica, with the divisions of the Britannic legions, which had been sent to support Vitellius against Otho, marched to the north. The 2 last named legions were sent to Cremona, the other forces to Hostilia, a village still existing as Ostilia on the lower course of the Padus. Caecina himself turned aside to Ravenna, in order to concert with Lucilius Bassus, the commander of the fleet, a treacherous desertion of Vitellius. Bassus was discontented because he had not been appointed praetorian prefect. It was soon known that the fleet had gone over to the enemy. This was the first blow to the cause of Vitellius. Caecina's army had encamped between Hostilia and the marshes of the river Tartarus, which flows into the Adriatic between the Padus and the Ephesus. It was a good position. The camp was covered by the river on the rear and flanked by the marsh. If Caecina had been in earnest, he should have been able to crush the 2 Pannonic legions before the Median troops arrived. But he delayed action on various pretexts, allowed the 5 Flavian legions to assemble at Verona, and finally tried to persuade his soldiers to desert to Vespasian. But his attempts were vain. The troops restored the images of Vitellius, which he and a few officers whom he beguiled had thrown down, and bound Caecina himself. They elected as their leaders Fabius Fabullus, legatus of the 5th legion, and Cassius Longus, prefect of the camp. Then they moved back to Hostilia, and proceeded to join the other legions at Cremona. When Primus learned what had happened, he determined that it was the favourable moment for action. The plans of the Vitellians had been thrown out by the desertion of Caecina. They had no leader of authority until Fabius Valens should arrive from Rome. Primus hastened to anticipate his arrival, and led his army in 2 days from Verona to Betriacum, in order to intercept the legions coming from Hostilia. Encamping at Betriacum, he advanced himself with some cavalry and corps of auxiliary foot towards Cremona, and falling in with some Vitellian troops, defeated them. The 2 legions stationed at Cremona, Italica and Rapex, then came up, and were beaten back by the Flavian legionaries, who had been summoned from Betriacum. In this conflict Primus left nothing undone that devolved upon a good general and a brave soldier. As the evening was falling, the whole body of the Flavian army came up, and the soldiers were eager to hurry on to Cremona and take it by assault. The efforts of Primus himself who tried to expose the folly of such an attempt, would hardly have been sufficient to restrain them, but the news arrived that the 6 legions of Hostilia had reached Cremona. They had crossed to the right bank of the Padus and marched to Cremona by Parma, and although they had accomplished 30 miles that day, they were so excited by the news of the defeat that they hastened to attack the Flavians the same night. Thus, in the same place where the struggle had been decided between Otho and Vitellius, was also to be decided the struggle between Vitellius and Vespasian. Primus made his dispositions for the battle as follows. He placed the 13th legion in the centre on the Via Postumia. Next it, on the left, in the open plain, was stationed the 7th Galbiana, and beyond it the 7th Claudiana. On the other side were placed, in corresponding positions, the 8th and the 3rd, of which the latter was protected by dense underwood. The Praetorians, whom Vitellius had disbanded, had joined Vespasian, and they stood near the 3rd. The flanks and rear were fringed with cavalry. The Suevian auxiliaries were in front. About 9 o'clock in the evening the Vitellian legions approached and drew up in disorder. Weary though they were with the long march, with hunger and cold, they pressed the Flavians hard, and the fierce and doubtful battle lasted the whole night through. The 7th Galbiana was especially hard pressed, but it was sustained by Primus, who sent the Praetorians to assist it. The ballistae and engines of the Vitellians, which they planted on the causeway, wrought great mischief among the Flavian ranks, till 2 brave soldiers lost their lives in cutting the cords which impelled the missiles. Fortune began to declare for the Flavians when the moon rose in their rear at an advanced hour of the night, and rendered the aim of the enemy more difficult. Primus rallied his flagging troops. The 3rd, which had been originally stationed in Syria, saluted the rising sun, and from this incident a report was spread that Mucianus had arrived with the eastern army. The Flavians, believing themselves reinforced, fought with confidence, and their foes, completely routed, fled to Cremona. Primus led on his victorious troops, excited with the prospect of plunder, against Cremona. In the war with Otho, the German soldiers had made their camp round the walls of the city, and surrounded the camp with a rampart. The Flavians stormed the camp with much labor, and then the town capitulated. But the soldiers, who hated the place, which had been twice the headquarters of the Vitellians, and burned with the desire of plundering the wealthy colony, did not respect the capitulation. Primus had retired to refresh himself with a bath, and when he complained that the water was not warm enough, the attendant said, "It will soon be hotter." The word was seized by some who heard it, and interpreted as a permission to burn the city. 40,000 armed men, with crowds of camp followers, burst into the place, and the inhabitants experienced all the horrors of military license. The miserable Cremona burned for 4 days, and no edifice was left in it except the temple of Mephitis, the deity of the marshes. If Valens had hurried northward, he might have reached Cremona in time to change the course of history, but his movements were slow. He sent 3 Praetorian cohorts which had followed him to Ariminum, went himself to Etruria, and having heard of the result of the battle of Cremona, took ship for Gaul, intending to rouse the northern provinces to retrieve the cause of Vitellius. But Valerius Paulinus, the procurator of Narbonensis, who had embraced his friend Vespasian's cause, succeeded in capturing Valens. Then the legions of the western provinces, Spain, Gaul, and Britain, declared for Vespasian. Meanwhile Umbria was occupied by the Flavians, and the cohorts at Ariminum were blockaded by land and sea. Italy was divided by the Apennines between Vespasian and Vitellius. The contest was not yet over, for the Praetorian Guards, the pick of the Germanic army, had taken no part hitherto in the war, and were still to be dealt with, and Vitellius had still a strong natural defence in the Apennines. Primus, leaving most of his army at Verona, led a force consisting of auxiliary cohorts and chosen legionaries along with the 11th legion from Dalmatia, to Fanum Fortunae. At this place, the present Fano, which lies between Ancona and Ariminum, the Flaminian road reaches the Adriatic Sea. Here Primus waited, expecting that the troops of Vitellius would desert the emperor. In the meantime, Vitellius had been burying his cares in sensual gratifications. At first he could hardly believe the tidings from Cremona, but when he was at length wakened out of his sleep, he sent 14 corps to defend the Apennine passes at Mevania, near Fulginium, on the Flaminian road. To these forces was added a new marine legion, which he formed from the fleet of Misenum. The remaining cohorts were kept to defend the city under the command of his brother Lucius Vitellius. The emperor himself visited the camp at Mevania, but on the news that the Misenum fleet had declared for the enemy, he returned to Rome. The next blow was the defection of Campania. The Samnites, Marsians, and Pellinians followed. Vitellius divided his forces. Some were stationed at Narnia to oppose the advance of the Flavians. Others were sent to check the movement in Campania. Primus crossed the Apennines with great difficulty, owing to the heavy snow, and stationed himself at Carsule, north of Narnia, where he was presently joined by his legions. The Vitellian cohorts had little spirit to fight, but when the head of Fabius Valens, whom they believed to be in Germany collecting a new army, was exhibited to them, they no longer hesitated, and submitted to the victor, who treated them with clemency in December. Primus then offered terms to Vitellius. If he submitted, he and his children should have a safe retreat in Campania. Mucianus wrote to the same effect, and Vitellius readily agreed to the proposal. Such a torpor had seized upon his spirit that he would himself have forgotten that he was princeps if the rest had not remembered it. The transference of the empire took place in the temple of Apollo. Vitellius came forth from the palace, clad in black, with his family around him, and proceeding to the forum, offered his dagger to the consul Caecilius, who refused to accept it. He then turned towards the Temple of Concord, to deposit there the insignia of empire, but a number of the Praetorian soldiers prevented him, and compelled him to return to the palace on December 17th. These adherents would not permit him to carry out the agreement. Senators and knights, the urban soldiery, and the courts of the watch, Vigiles, had gathered to the house of Vespasian's brother, Flavius Sabinus, who had acted as a mediator. They urged Sabinus to occupy the palace in his brother's interest. But as they conveyed him thither, on December 18th, they were attacked by the Vitellians at a place called the Pool of Fundanius. Sabinus and a few others fled to the Capitoline hill and shut themselves up in the temple of Jupiter. The Vitellians guarded the approaches, but during a violent storm of rain Sabinus communicated with his friends and received into the place of refuge both his own children and his nephew Domitian, the son of Vespasian. The next morning the Vitellians assaulted the Capitol. From the Forum they rushed up the Clivus, but the Flavians, issuing on the roof of the portico, which reached from the temple of Saturn to the Capitol, hurled down stones and tiles. The assailants then set fire to the portico, and would have passed through the burnt door into the court of the temple, if Sabinus had not torn down the statues and monuments which filled the place, and thus constructed a barrier. Foiled here, the Vitellians attempted other ways of ascent. One of these rose from the shoulder of the hill, another was close to the Tarpeian rock, and known as the 100 Stairs. By the former especially they forced their way along the tops of houses and with the help of fire. At length the conflagration broke out on the summit of the hill, and the temple of Jupiter was consumed. Domitian escaped and hid himself in a porter's hut, but Sabinus was seized and carried to the palace, where, in spite of the attempts of Vitellius to save him, he was slain, and his trunk dragged to the Gemonian stairs outside the carcer. on December 19th. Immediately after this, Cerealis, who had been sent on by Primus, arrived with 1,000 horsemen and tried to force his way into Rome, but the Vitalians were prepared and drove him back. Primus was himself close at hand and had reached Saxa Rubra when he learned the destruction of the capital and the repulse of Cerealis. The slaughter of Sabinus rendered further negotiations impossible, and the deputation of the Vestals beseeching for a conference was rejected. The Flavians attacked Rome in 3 divisions. One party approached the Colline gate, another marched through fields along the bank of the Tiber, and a third band, between these, advanced along the Flaminian way. The Vitalians, who had armed the rabble and the slaves, went forth to meet them, but were driven back with slaughter. Conquerors and conquered entered the city together, and the battle was renewed in the streets. Then the Praetorian camp was stormed. It is said that 50,000 men were slain in this capture of Rome. Vitellius tried to make his escape to join his brother Lysias, who held Terracina, but he was discovered, dragged from his hiding-place, and amid the mockery of the soldiers was haled to the Gemonian stairs and slain with insults. December 20th or 21st. His last words were perhaps the only he had ever uttered worth recording: "Yet I was your imperator." Thus perished the first emperor who had been set up by the Germanic legions. His brother Lucius Vitellius, who had occupied Terracina, soon afterwards surrendered and was put to death. For a second time in the same year Rome was occupied by a victorious army, and citizens were exposed to the license of soldiers greedy for plunder, whom their leader Primus did not keep in check. Domitian, the second son of Vespasian, was installed in the palace, and received the name of Caesar, but the power was in the hands of Primus, a soldier whom Vespasian had no intention of placing in such a position. But he did not enjoy the pleasures of power long. Mucianus presently arrived, and his entry into the city was felt as a relief. He acted as a semi-official representative of Vespasian until Vespasian came himself. He sternly suppressed the license of the soldiers, dismissed the Illyric legions from Rome, and taught Primus his place. He put to death Galerianus, the son of Piso, whom Galba had made his colleague, and Asiaticus, a freedman of Vitellius. The Senate hastened to make the victorious imperator a legitimate emperor by the usual decrees, conferring on him the proconsular power, the title Augustus, and other prerogatives. The tribunician power, however, does not seem to have been conferred upon him until a considerably later time. The emperor and his elder son Titus were designated consuls for the year 70. The praetorship and consular power were decreed to Domitian. The triumphal ornaments were voted to Mucianus for his defence of Mysia against the Dacian invasion, which had taken place as he passed through that province. Antonius Primus and Arius Varus, who was made praetorian prefect, received the lesser distinctions of the consular and praetorian insignia, respectively. Thus the remarkable year of the 4 emperors came to an end. The events between the death of Nero and the victory of Vespasian throw instructive light on the conditions of the empire. The following points deserve notice. 1. The most striking motive which determined the course of the civil wars was the exclusive and jealous esprit de corps which was growing up among the different armies. The Germanic army was hostile to Galba because he was proclaimed by the Spanish legion, and the Eastern and Illyric armies were jealous of the Germanic troops because they proclaimed Vitellius. 2. Galba, however, cannot be considered so strictly a candidate set up by the soldiers as Vitellius and Vespasian. He posed as a senatorial candidate, and was not forced upon the Senate in the same way as the emperors who came from Germany and Syria. 3. Each successive emperor professed to represent the cause of him whom his rival had overthrown. Vespasian came to avenge Otho, and Otho came to avenge Nero, and Vitellius, though when first proclaimed he was the rival of Galba, afterwards posed as his successor. 4. Although the legions arrogated the right of creating emperors, they recognized that their candidates were only pretenders until they possessed Rome and were acknowledged by the Senate. 5. The dilemma in which the empire was placed in regard to the question of dynastic succession is clearly shown. While the hereditary principle was followed, weak or bad rulers like Gaius and Nero were an inevitable result. On the other hand, when there was no candidate with an hereditary claim to the Principate, the state was exposed to the dangers of civil war, such as followed on the death of Nero. 6. Dynastic succession, however, was considered the least evil. The fact that he had no children deterred Mucianus from accepting the empire, and perhaps the same motive influenced Virginius. Both Otho and Vitellius destined their children as their successors, and Vespasian founded a new dynasty. Galba, who had no children, resorted to the principle of adoption, following the example of Augustus. Each of the emperors, with the exception of Vitellius, attached himself in a certain manner to the house of the Julii and Claudii by adopting the name Caesar, and even Vitellius assumed it in his last crisis. End of chapter 19, section 3.